Hey guys. Hello, what's up? Welcome back to my channel. Welcome back to another video. My name is Sam. If you're new here, thank you so much for stopping by and welcome. It's so nice to meet you. I hope you decide to stick around. Oh, today I thought we could talk a little bit about wet sticks. If you have a wet stick or you're thinking about purchasing or swapping, someone gives you a wet stick and you just don't know what to do with it to turn it into a plant, to get roots, to get new growth. That's what we're going to talk about today, and the method that I will be talking about in particular is sphagnum moss. Been here a while, then you probably know that your girl loves her some sphagnum moss. When it comes to rooting, rehabbing, propagating, you name it, sphagnum moss is typically the way I go. Don't get me wrong, I do use water occasionally it just depends on the plant, honestly, but probably 8 out of 10 times, I'm gonna use moss. Let's go ahead and get into it, guys. I'm gonna show you guys some of my wet sticks that are now fully established plants. I'm gonna tell you how I take care of plants in moss and different environments, because it definitely depends on the type of environment the plant or wet stick or propagation is living in, how you will care for that plant in moss. So let's go ahead and get right into it. I'm excited to show you guys some of my little moss babies that are looking real cute. We are gonna start off, also look over my hair. Your girl's having a bad hair day today, okay? Okay, we're gonna talk about this beautiful girl, my Philodendron varicosum. So this video is actually recommended by one of you lovely people, plant friend, one of my subscribers, and I thought it was a great idea. She asked me to talk about my Philodendron varicosum and watering in moss, I believe was what she recommended. So that's why we're gonna go ahead and talk about the varicosum first. I showed this in my repotting video, my last video. I potted her up from moss. She's been living in moss now since, it was like late summer or early fall whenever I did a swap and got this girl. And yeah, it was a stick. She lost the only leaf that she had. It was a top growth cutting, but it was just a stick. There was no roots, there was no leaves, nothing. As we can see, she has finally graduated to soil and a real life pot. This is her newest leaf here. Insanely gorgeous. I have her velcroed to this moss pole, which is a little bit too big for the pot, but it's working. It's working out. Look at the back of those leaves, gorgeous. And we have another new leaf coming in here. This plant had been living in moss for about 7 months. She had a very long and significant root system. This is one of my wet stick propagations that was very successful. Very proud of this girl. This is my Philodendron melanochrysum, and as we can see, she is still living in moss. This was from the same girl that I traded for the varicosum, but this was our second trade. So we made another trade in the future after that one, probably a month or so after we did the first one. And this was the original leaf that came on this stick. So it was a wet stick, but it had this beautiful leaf. And as we can see, it has pushed off, I think, 2 growth points that died after shipping. Like, they just didn't make it. They withered up and they fell off, basically. I had to remove them. But look at this. So gorgeous. So if you have a wet stick and you're wanting to root in moss, what are the first steps? So you're gonna take your sphagnum moss, whatever brand or type you prefer, you soak it, get it nice and wet and spongy, and then you're gonna wring it out as well as you can. And you're gonna take either a plastic or a glass container, it doesn't matter. So you're gonna wring the moss out, you're gonna put it in a plastic or a glass container, or you can also do a terrarium style setup for your plants, depending on if it's a more sensitive type of plant. Like, I have some begonias over here and some little glass enclosures that I'll share with you in a moment, and they are living in sphagnum moss. But for rooting things like philodendron specifically, you're going to put them in the moss, and honestly, the wet stick or the plant is going to root much better and much faster if you put it in an enclosed space. So either a little dome, a begonia bubble, anything enclosed that's going to increase the humidity, a greenhouse, that would be great. It's going to encourage the plant to root a lot faster in the moss, and it's also going to encourage the plant to start pushing out new growth. So if you put it in something like this, as you can see, there's no holes or drainage in this container whatsoever. There's no holes or drainage in this one either. So the moss in these containers are going to stay moist a little bit longer than they are in something like if you were to use a pot with drainage, or like a terracotta, which I would definitely not suggest using terracotta for rooting with sphagnum moss, it's going to dry out entirely too fast, and it's probably just not going to do that well. Terracotta pots are just way too porous. It's not going to hold in moisture or humidity whatsoever. So like this is an exception, but I've had this living in my humidity box for this entire time. So this is in a plastic pot, which does have holes, but I will tell you it dries out very quickly. So I'm constantly having to stay on top of watering this moss. Anyway, it's going to stay moist a lot longer if it's A, in a container that doesn't have drainage, and B, if it's in an enclosed space. If it's in a terrarium, if it's closed up, there's not a lot of air getting to the moss to dry it out. So you don't have to water as often, and you definitely want to make sure that the moss is dried completely out, especially with things like aeroids, before you water it again. So that's what I'll do. It's very easy to tell when the moss is dry. So this moss is not completely dry just yet. I mean, it's dry, but if you push on it and feel down in the moss, you can feel it's still a little bit moist down in there. So this doesn't need a water just yet. This is fully rooted. This is a philodendron plowmanii. You can see this is its first new leaf that it's given me. This was a little chunk right here. There was no leaves at all. It lost all of its leaves, all of its roots, because it was shipped to me with severe root rot. It has another growth point right there. So yeah, this dries out really quick. Even being in a humidity box, it still dries out pretty fast just because there's drainage in the bottom. So something to keep in mind. This is my billieti, which was also a wet stick. Basically, it was a little chunk. I rotted its roots and lost all of its foliage, and it's been living in here now for seriously almost a year, guys, probably a year at this point. So I really need to get it out of here. This leads me to my next point, which is the only negative thing that I have to say about moss, the only thing you need to be a little bit cautious of. This is a great example. So once you see that roots have started to form on the plant that you're trying to root, it's okay to leave them in the moss a little while after you know that it's got established roots, but I definitely wouldn't suggest leaving them in the moss for like a year, because this is what's going to happen. You can see the bottom's completely filled with roots. Yeah, right here's a big root. This has been in here just entirely too long. You can see that there's green on the moss. That is algae. And once you start getting algae on your moss, you really need to change it or switch the plant to soil if it's ready, because what happens with algae is that it's not detrimental to our plants or anything, but it is a live thing. So the algae will start competing with the plant for nutrients, basically, and we definitely don't want that. So yeah, algae is not a great thing to have in your moss. But also, if your roots spend too long growing and attaching to that moss, you're going to have a pretty difficult time removing the moss from the roots whenever it comes time to pot your plant up. So this is my philodendron Jose Bueno, and this is another good example. I actually sold the base of the plant, which had like 3 leaves, I think, and I took this massive cutting for myself. Granted, it's put off, this is its 4th leaf, I think, that it's put off since I cut it. And this guy's been living in moss for about 6 months, I would say, maybe, and he's been in here entirely too long as well. So he's in this little glass candle holder. You can see he has roots right here, roots coming up out of the top. I mean, there's just roots everywhere. This is a very small container to begin with, and it's completely full of roots now, so I can water it and literally the next day this moss is going to be completely dry, which it's not harming the plant. It's still growing, but you can see its last couple of leaves here are a lot smaller than the ones it was giving me prior. This is his newest leaf here, which is probably going to be even smaller than his last 2. So yeah, he's crammed in there. He's very root bound in this moss in this container. So I'm going to be taking him out really soon now that spring's here and potting him up in some soil. And I'm probably going to have a little bit of a difficult time getting him and my billieti out of this moss. What I will typically do whenever I have a plant that's been living in moss this long and the roots are super tangled up in the moss, so like if it's in a container like this, I'm going to have to break this jar because there's no getting this out without ripping the roots and damaging the roots. So I'm gonna have to break this jar, unfortunately, to get him out. I've already accepted that, it's fine. But if you can pull them out of the container that they're in, you just take the root ball and set it in some lukewarm water, let it set for an hour or 2, and that will help the moss loosen up from the roots so that you're better able to remove it from the plant without damaging the roots too much. But that's what happened to my squamiferum. It was in moss for over a year. No matter what I did, I let it soak for like 4 hours. I still lost a bunch of the roots trying to remove that moss, and completely damaged the plant. The roots ended up dying when I put it in soil, and now I'm trying to reroot it. It lost all of its foliage. Really, really sad. But it can be dangerous to leave your plant in the moss too long once roots are established. So it's a good idea, you know, to not leave them in the moss more than 2-3 months max, I would say, and then go ahead and take them out, put them in soil, good to go. They'll be happy in the moss, don't get me wrong. They'll grow very, very well, thrive in the moss. My plants anyway love it. They absolutely love it. They live there forever if I let them. But there comes a point in time when they need nutrients from soil, and it's time to move them over, you know? But yeah, that's my only negative whenever it comes to rooting plants in sphagnum moss. Now, if you have a plant that you intend on keeping in sphagnum moss, you want it to live there forever, more power to you. Go ahead and, you know, leave it in there, let it thrive and do its thing. Go back to watering. So for things like my aroids, I allow the moss, like I said, to dry completely out like this. Like, I don't know if you guys can hear that, but it's so dry that when you press on it, it actually makes like a crunchy sound from the moss being so dry. That's typically how dry I will allow most of my aroids to get before I go ahead and give them a water, because I definitely don't want to cause any root rot whatsoever. And whenever I water the moss, I don't water it so much that it's dripping. I don't water it so much that you can see moss standing in the container that it's in. That's too much water. So I thought I'd give you guys an example of what too much water in your moss looks like. If you can tilt it and puddles of water accumulate in the container, that is way too much. Look over the cute baby hands. Yeah, this is a no-no. If you can squish it and water comes up above the moss like this, way too much water. I literally only water the moss enough to saturate it. And now here's a great example of perfectly moistened moss. So the moss should still be, even when wet, really fluffy and airy. It shouldn't be packed down because there's so much water making it heavy. Yeah, this is perfect. And moss is very absorbent, so you put some on the top and it'll absorb all the way down to the bottom. So maybe that's what you do. You pour a little bit of water on the top of the moss, and then you wait a minute and let that absorb down through. And if it's not wet all the way down through, then go ahead and add a little bit more water, because you do want all of the moss to get moist. You just don't want it to be soggy or dripping or puddling in the container. Just enough to make it moist. Hope that makes sense. So let's talk about plants that are living in sphagnum moss in terrariums or enclosed space, such as begonias. So here's one of my little glass enclosures, and this has a couple begonias in it. So it has my cute little begonia listida, which absolutely thrives in moss in an enclosed space. She loves it so much. And then this is a little begonia red planet. If you can see him, he's really cute. I actually just recently moved him into this moss. He's been living in soil in a begonia bubble, but I have found that many of my begonias, particularly my terrarium begonias, they love moss and they love enclosed spaces. So I have tons of these little glass containers with moss that I keep plants in. But anyway, so for a plant like this, especially if you're going to keep the top covered, like I usually will put saran wrap or something over the top to keep the humidity up in here. But for plants like this, honestly, they're so low maintenance. I feel like a lot of people probably think that having plants in moss in one of these little enclosed spaces is like a lot of maintenance or upkeep or a pain in the butt, but it's honestly not. These are so much easier to care for, much less maintenance than any of my other plants, because they take care of themselves. So I typically only have to water the moss maybe once every 2 to 3 weeks in these, because I'm keeping the top covered. Therefore, all of the moisture is staying contained inside of the glass. So the moss stays moist, and I don't have to do anything. I put it under a light and it takes care of itself. Everything grows wonderfully. And that's that. Also, guys, keep in mind that the amount of light you're giving your plant that's in moss is going to determine how quickly it dries out. The begonias that I have in here, it's really not good to get their leaves wet, so you don't want to just go dumping water into these to water the moss. You don't want to get the leaves wet and then cover the top and there's all that moisture in there. That will cause the begonia leaves to rot or get fungus, turn black and mushy. You don't want that mess. So the way that I will typically water water begonias that are in an enclosure like this, they make little like squeezy bottles that have like the long nozzles so that you can like really get in there without getting the leaves wet to water. But what I've been using is actually a baby nose sucker, like the bulb suckers, the old-fashioned bulb suckers, but it's the blue ones that they give you at the hospital when you have a baby with the little skinny tip. Yeah, so I'll take that and I'll fill it up with my water, and I'll go in and I'll squeeze it around the base of the plant and moisten the moss that way, so that I'm not getting water on the plants themselves and then covering them up and having them in that wet environment. So that's the best way that I've found to water in these when you don't want to get the leaves wet. Another little terrarium situation that I have is this big guy, and this is actually really new. The plants aren't new, but this container is, and it's just a big cookie jar from Kroger. I rarely find any this size, so I found this and I picked it up. Just specifically for this plant. So look how foggy it is in there. Oh, it's not, you guys can't really see, but it's actually foggy in there. So this is my beautiful Begonia chloristicta, and then I also have a philodendron brandy in there. These two have lived together for the longest time now. And then I also have placed my Anthurium violinorum in there to see how he does. The brandy and the chloristicta have been living together in a glass enclosure like this size, and my chloristicta completely outgrew it. She was too tall and I couldn't cover the top anymore. So I've been on the hunt for something large enough to fit her in. I am getting like a big terrarium for Botanicas soon, I think, like one of the medium-sized ones. But in the meantime, this is going to work great, I think. These guys are fully rooted, so I'm not trying to root them or anything in this moss. They're just simply living their life in the moss. So this is a little bit different situation. We're not trying to root them, but they are humidity loving plants. They do want higher humidity, and yeah, they just do very well living in moss. So that's why I have these guys in moss and the top covered. Yeah, so for this, it's kind of the same thing. I'll go in and moisten all the way around the top, let it soak down into the bottom until all of it looks saturated. I mean, you can tell if the moss is wet or dry. It's fairly easy just by sight, definitely by touch. So that's just the main thing. Moss is very vocal in that way, I guess. Like, it'll tell you when it's dry, it'll tell you when it's wet. And I just love the fact that it evenly saturates itself. You put the water in there and it evenly distributes it throughout all of the moss. And it's just wonderful. And then when it dries out, it typically dries out all the same. I mean, the top layer obviously dries first, but the bottom layer is not going to stay super wet while the top of the moss is super dry, if that makes sense. And then for these, like I said, with the lid on this, I'm not going to have to water this, but maybe like once every 3 weeks. For real, it's amazing. Sometimes whenever I water my plants that are in these glass enclosures like this, I'll leave the top off. Instead of just watering and throwing the top back on right away, sometimes I'll leave the top off for a day or two. As long as it's not a plant that's going to completely throw a fit and die from being exposed to air, I'll leave the top off for typically a day or two just to allow some of that moisture to kind of come up out and a little bit of airflow to get down in the jar. And then I'll put the top back on. And the moss is still going to be wet, so you don't have to worry about it drying out completely in a day or two. Put the top back on, and it's not too wet, but still moist enough to get the job done and keep these guys happy. My philodendron painted lady up there was rooted in moss. She lived in moss for over a year before I finally potted her up. I even do Hoya. So I sold the mother plant to this. This is Hoya surreyjoensis, and this is a cutting I took for myself. And she's loving the new home. She put off these beautiful new reddish purple leaves in this window right here. Loving life. But this plant is fully rooted. It really needs to be potted up in soil at this point because, again, it's in a plastic pot. It has drainage. It's full of roots, and it's not living in an enclosed space, therefore it's drying out like daily. Like, I'll water it and the next day it's completely dry again. So for plants like Hoya, when it comes to rooting them and or keeping them in moss, I typically don't water the moss until I notice that the leaves are soft. So even if the moss feels and appears to be dry to me, if it's a Hoya and the leaves are still really firm and plump, then I'm not going to go ahead and water that moss until I notice, just like I would if it was in soil. So if it's in soil, even if the soil seems dry, but if the leaves are still nice and plump and juicy, I'm not going to water that soil until the leaves have a little bit of give and a little bit of bend like this. Then you know it's time to give them a good drink. Same with moss. I do sometimes propagate things in like little Tupperware bowls like this, and if it's a clear lid, that's fine to put it on, but these have like blue lids or something, so I've got saran wrap over this. I don't even know what's in here exactly, to be honest with you. But for things like this, because it's covered, again, it's not going to dry out too fast unless you have it vented. For things like this, I'll typically just take a spray bottle and moisten the moss this way, spray it really, really good, let that absorb down into the rest of the moss, put the top back over, and again, good to go. Super, super easy. I hope I touched on everything, guys. Like I said, when it comes to the best containers to use for rooting your plants, when it comes to using sphagnum moss, of course, I've definitely found either plastic or glass, and it's definitely better. You're going to not have to water as often if there's no drainage in it. That's just my own personal experience. Also, you want to use something like this. Really isn't great because you can see the jar is pretty wide and pretty fat, and then the top is just a mason jar. The top is a little bit more narrow than the body of the jar. I even have one container that's really narrow at the top and then it's really wide the rest of the way down, and I really struggle to get a rooted plant out of that because whenever you go to pull it out, the root and moss mass is a lot bigger than the opening of the jar. So my biggest tips is just water the moss whenever it's completely dry, or when you're noticing signs in your plant that you would typically notice in soil that is thirsty. Go ahead and give it a water. Just moisten. Put a little water on the top, let it soak down through. You don't want any standing water in the vessel you're propagating with. If you see standing water in the moss, or it's like so wet that when you push down on it, it squishes water out of it, it's too wet, way too wet, entirely too wet. Moist, not soaked. Let it dry out completely in between waterings. When you start seeing signs of the green algae growing on the moss, go ahead and either remove the pieces with the algae, replace the moss with fresh moss. You can also fertilize in moss. I don't know if other people do this, but I definitely do. Sometimes I will put some Super Thrive, like a vitamin supplement. Sometimes I'll use my phytoplankton fertilizer and put just a little bit in the water that I'm using to water the moss. That'll definitely help your roots out and help your plant out, because remember, there's no nutrients in moss like there is soil, so they're not going to be getting the nutrients that they would be in their soil. So you got to keep that in mind as well. If you're going to have a plant living in moss for a long period of time, or you plan on keeping it there forever, you do need to fertilize that water or get them some nutrients somehow, one way or another. I think I've pretty much covered everything though, guys. I think I showed you guys everything I wanted to show. I have a lot more plants in my collection that I have rooted and grown this way that are now full plants and that are thriving. And also, don't leave them in the moss too long. Once you have an established root system, I would recommend going ahead and maybe no longer than a couple months, taking it from the moss and placing it in soil or whatever medium you plan to grow the plant in. Soak the moss if your roots are super grown and entangled into it. Soak it to remove it. Don't jerk or pull on any of the roots trying to get the moss off. It can also be a little bit difficult to differentiate between roots and moss once it gets to that point. So just be cautious, and I think that's all I got for you guys. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you found it helpful. If you have any suggestions for how you work with sphagnum moss when it comes to your plants, feel free to drop them below and leave us any tips and tricks that you might have. I'm sure others would appreciate it, as would I. Also, feel free to drop video suggestions. I very much appreciate that. This was a suggestion from one of you, like I said, and I love it because sometimes my brain just doesn't work and it goes blank. Don't forget to like this video if you found it helpful or you enjoyed it. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss future videos, and turn on the notification bell if you'd like to be notified whenever I do post. Also, drop a comment because it does help a ton with the algorithm and it just helps my channel out in general. Again, thank you guys. I'll see you soon. Bye guys.